Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. Before we get started, I want to let everybody know we want to keep Betty Hoss in our prayers and her family. Her husband passed away, Paul Hoss. He was 91 and was just a brilliant man, but we certainly want to remember Betty and the family as they grieve his loss. And there will be a private service here in our memorial garden at the end of the month, and I'm going to be honored to be there for them. These are wonderful, wonderful people who have meant so much to our church over the years. Our Bible study tonight is out of Nurturing Faith. This is the former Baptist Today, and there's a guy named Tony Cartledge that writes these. They used to use lots of different authors, and 3 out of 4 times they'd be good, and then there'd be some that just were pretty boring. But this guy always does a good job, and this particular passage, this Bible study, is on the Transfiguration, which is a really fascinating thing for me because you all know that I have a hobby of reading near-death experiences, and a lot of times when people come back from these experiences and they describe being visited by angels or others, it is very similar to the description that we find in this scripture. So I think he does just a beautiful job, and we just kind of have to ask ourselves how this relates to our lives today. And I think he does a wonderful job of this. This is out of Mark 9, and it reads this way. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Got to wonder what they were talking about. Then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, as if they needed something to dwell in. He did not know what to say because they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and the cloud there came a voice, This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead, so they kept the matter to themselves. Can you imagine having to keep something like that to yourselves? And I wonder, does that mean that they kept it only to themselves or just the other disciples? And if they did tell the other disciples, how did they process what that must have been like? Well, the author begins by asking this question, have you ever dreamed about becoming more than you are? And, you know, I have to say, I don't think so. I think we all certainly wonder what heaven would be like or what we may be like in heaven, but not. I guess I would have to answer that question negatively in terms of here on earth. However, y'all know that I was born on Halloween, and that's it's very reflective of who I am. This idea of being able to dress up and become something else once a year, be someone that you're not. I've always thought of that, but I certainly have not thought of myself as being transfigured in this way. But it's a really interesting thought. He says superhero movies feed the fantasy. Like Clark Kent going into the telephone booth and coming out as Superman. He says we may transform in lesser ways and not always a good way. Facing enough stress, a normally calm person can suddenly act in ways that are totally out of character. I'll bet you have witnessed something like this in the last year because people have been all cooped up and quarantined, and sometimes they just act out in ways that's not themselves. I had a buddy was telling me he was at a red light, and this guy was jogging and felt someone cut him off and walked up and punched this poor lady's window out of her car, and he had to yell at him to come. He was going to try to get away, and he had to yell at him that he was going to call the police if he didn't stop and pay for this lady's car. And he said you could almost see it on this guy that he just lashed out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden, kind of gained control of himself. And so I think we're going to see this increasingly as all of this unfolds. We kind of have to ask ourselves, are we going to transform better, or are we going to transform worse? I certainly hope as Christians that we're aware of this and we want to do better. Well, this text describes the fascination and frustration of Jesus' three closest friends when they were granted a glimpse of his eternal identity. Have you ever? I've never really seen it, I heard it put that way, that this was, a glimpse into, how Jesus might appear in heaven. Well, he breaks this down into three parts. He calls one, the backstory; two, the big event; and then three, the difference that it makes in our lives. So Jesus was trying to teach the disciples about his true identity, and he also sought to strengthen his own resolve for what lay ahead. Can you imagine what Jesus was, how he was trying to prepare? He knew what was coming, the cross, but the disciples just did not understand, but he was trying to prepare them. That had to be so difficult to do. He says, the 12 had been with Jesus for some time. They had heard him teach with authority, seen him perform mighty works, felt his heartwarming love, and had puzzled over his parables. Jesus may have wondered if they would ever really understand. Many times I'll say when I'm reading a passage of Scripture, I can almost feel Jesus' frustration with the disciples on so many levels. They had been there, seen everything, but they still did not get it. And ironically, that gives me great comfort because we don't get it so much. They were right there and still didn't get it. And that gives me comfort that, we can't figure out everything, but we should certainly always be on the road to trying. He says to help the disciples understand, Jesus took three disciples who were close to him, Peter, James, and John, and led them up the mountain so they could go deeper in understanding. Well, here's where he describes the big events. It says, as they settled down at a certain place, Jesus underwent a mind-blowing transformation the Gospels struggle to describe. Now, remember my fascination with near-death experiences when people come back from a heavenly experience. And so often they say exactly what the author says, the Gospels are struggling to do here. It is trying to use earthly words to describe heavenly events. So many times people will describe, there's no word for these colors that I saw. There's no words that I can use to describe how bright the lights were and how it felt, all those things. So I love the fact that he includes that. He says, it was as if Jesus, who had been described as a Galilean peasant, suddenly threw off his human form and reverted to a more heavenly, glorified appearance. Jesus was transformed. He says, a window opened between heaven and earth, allowing eternity to penetrate our world and time, granting the disciples a vision of the eternal Christ within the earthly Jesus. Beautifully written. The vision included two surprise visitors from Hebrew history, Moses and Elijah. Why those two? Well, those are two really important figures and very symbolic in the Hebrew faith. Moses represented the law, Elijah represented the prophets. He says Jewish traditions held that both Moses and Elijah would return to earth before the, quote, day of the Lord. Now they were standing before the disciples and upholding Jesus and giving way to him. When Moses and Elijah departed, Jesus was left alone. The law and the prophets had found their fulfillment in the person of Christ. That is just so well written. Now, all three of the synoptic gospels say that Jesus, Moses, and Elijah carried on a conversation for some time, but only Luke hints at what that conversation was about. He said they talked about what was yet to come for Jesus. His departure had to be accomplished at Jerusalem. In your mind, imagine having that conversation, knowing what was coming, and fast forward to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing what lay ahead of him, and literally praying so hard that drops of blood were coming out of his eyes because he knew. The disciples didn't understand, but he knew what was coming and was willing. So he says, When the three disciples thought their senses couldn't possibly be more overloaded, the voice of God sounded, and the disciples fell to their faces as God's words reverberated through them. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And then the voice was still, and the cloud departed, and it was all back to normal. When the bedazzled disciples peeked through their fingers, there was Jesus sitting alone in the grass, waiting for them. And I think he makes a really interesting point here. They had to wonder, had they been awake? Had they been sleeping? Was it real or was it a dream? Could they all have had the same dream? They chose to believe it was real, shockingly real. Just as God's voice had spoken at Jesus' baptism, validating his call to ministry, so now God's voice had spoken again to impress the disciples with the truth that Jesus knew who he was and what he was doing, and they had best give attention to his words. Well, he ends by this idea of what difference does this make to us. He says the awesome truth of the story is that Jesus' transformation carries with it the promise of our own transformation, both internally and ultimately, if we will listen to Jesus and follow him. It may be hard for us to believe that. Of course, that's hard for us to believe. It's hard for us as Christians to really implement the teachings of Christ into our life. It's not easy. It's difficult to do, but we have to try. He says it's hard to see beyond present realities to eternal hopes. In this life, it is unlikely that we will see Jesus, Moses, and Elijah the way the three disciples saw them. But as astonishing vision reached out to them across space and time, it continues to call out to us. It reaches out to us as well. We always have to keep this in mind when we're reading the Bible. We're not reading just about historical events. These stories are reaching out to us all these centuries later because they are so relevant to our lives now. He says, when we listen to Jesus, he calls us to be transformed. And this does not happen immediately for us, but it can happen. He ends by quoting a verse from 1 Corinthians 3:18, and it says, and all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of God as through reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. You know, if we have God in our lives, then we become more like that. Whatever is our God, small g, if we don't put God first in our life, we become more like that. Well, he began by saying, have you ever dreamed about becoming more than you are? And I hope that we always do, at least in this sense. We have to do more than those who came before us, so that our children can do more than when they come after us. He asked the question, do you dream about becoming more than you are? Well, yes and no, but I do dream about my children having it better than I did, and them standing on my shoulders, just like I have tried to stand on those who have come before me. Are you like that? Do you have people in your family that got to a different place so that you could be in a better place? The same thing is expected of us. God does have expectations for us to transform. I hope this has found you well. I so hope everybody is being safe and getting the vaccination when they have the opportunity, because I so look forward to shaking hands and hugging again. Be blessed.